I am live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. Just checking with Facebook. I think we are good. Excellent. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of two lead faculty for modern management of the older adult. We have 3 courses in our curriculum. We have our 8-week online Essential Foundations. If you have taken that course, you can go on to do our 8-week online Advanced Concepts. And we have our live course that is going to be hitting the ground running in 2022. I have 1 closed contract left for the year in Oakland. And then after that, we're really hitting the ground running in 2022. So if you're looking to get into a live geriatrics course, check us out on ptonice.com. And if you haven't signed up for our bi-weekly research email MMOA digest, I encourage you to do that at ptonice.com/resources. Okay, I have a big smile on my face because I have just been made aware, and this came out a couple months ago, but there are new exercise guidelines for older adults that came out through the International Conference for Research in Sarcopenia and Frailty, Sarcopenia and Frailty Research, HiDEF, and I want to go through them with you. If you have taken any of our MMOA courses, you know that the guideline that creates the backbone for a lot of our exercise prescription principles for older adults relates to the ACSM guideline for older adults. It was last revised in 2009, so it's now over 10 years old. There has been so much research that has been done, and it focuses on the backbone of community healthy older adults over the age of 65. If you've been working in geriatrics for any length of time, you know that most of the people that are coming to your clinic have multimorbidity. So we know that over 50% of older adults over the age of 65 have more than 2 chronic conditions, and that statistic jumps to 80% over the age of 80. Most of us who are working in geriatrics are working almost exclusively with people over the age of 70 or 75. So we are dealing with complex conditions. We are not necessarily dealing with the healthy master's athlete. If you are working in the outpatient setting, you might get a little bit more grace with that, but definitely things that we're going to be thinking about is that we need to be considering multimorbidity. What's been happening in the exercise space is that we are starting to recognize that some of our relative contraindications to exercise can actually create more barriers to movement. And when we're really taking it back to the baseline, we know that movement trumps no movement almost always. And so the risk factors that we see with older adults are few and far between. And the accelerator of chronic disease burden with sedentary behavior and physical inactivity is actually probably worse than acknowledging some of the low level of risk for trying to be active for individuals with complex chronic conditions. So with that in mind, I wanted to review some of these guidelines. This is an open access article, so I can post the DOI below. I'm going to be doing a post on social media about this today because I think it's really important. It is a bear of an article, which I love, but it's over 20 pages long. It goes into depth in a lot of different ways around the process of human aging, some of our thoughts around multimorbidity, some of the specific recommendations that we are going to make when it comes to different pathologies, and it's got some nice charts and tables that kind of outline some of these recommendations. If you remember the ACSM guideline, they talked about, getting 150 minutes of moderate, 75 minutes of vigorous physical activity aerobically each week, 2 times a week, 60% of 1 rep max, 8 to 12 repetitions, major muscle groups for resistance training, balance, if necessary, do it, and flexibility, probably not necessary, but if it feels good, go for it. That's kind of like the baseline of our exercise prescription for older adults. This recommendation takes it a step further, and I love it. So the first thing that it talks about is that when we think about aging, we have this non-healthy phenotype and this healthy phenotype. And it talks about chronic disease as exercise deficiency diseases. And I Could not love that more. We know that a lot of chronic diseases are related to healthy lifestyle. I'm not dismissing the impact of other lifestyle factors, like nutrition and stress management and sleep, social interaction. All that is really important. But in the contextualization of physical activity guidelines, they talk about how important it is for us to recognize that we may not actually be dealing with this chronic disease if we were having older adults be sufficiently active in the first place. And so it talks about how there's often two streams for how individuals get into a physical activity program. You have people who don't have pathology, who are going through the aging process but don't have a high disease burden, who are physically active, and this is precipitating more healthy aging constructs. So this is allowing older adults to be able to have more reserve, more resiliency, avoid 1 rep max living, and feel like they have this decreased time of morbidity. We call this squaring the curve, right? That's one way that people enter into the physical activity space. This is the way we want people to be activating into that guideline, but that's oftentimes what's not the case. What can happen more often, and what we see more in the rehab space, are occupational therapists and PTs. We see it as a therapy or an intervention based on some sort of pathology, whether that be a musculoskeletal injury, whether that be a chronic disease exacerbation or initial diagnosis. And we're using physical activity to try and minimize the impact or morbidity that is occurring because of that chronic disease. So there's different ways that we can enter into the physical activity space. And I think that's a really important thought to be conceptualizing, because the person who's coming into the healthy phenotype, or the person who's sufficiently active and going through the aging process, is going to be more likely to hit those previous ACSM guidelines than a person who's coming in with the quote unquote non-healthy phenotype with this heavy disease burden, that we're using physical activity as a method of intervention to try and reduce that burden and improve or optimize health based on the background of medical intervention that they currently have. And so that's kind of how they lay the foundation for this paper, which, I cannot get behind more, and how important it is to have some of these lifestyle modifications. And so then it goes through different pathologies, and it goes through different goals of physical activity, right? And so we talk about this in MMOA a lot. We have to recognize that we need specific interventions. Get Stronger. Julie talked about this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and Alex referred to this in respect to balance training. Is we need to have a specific goal that we're trying to improve, and then our exercise programming has to reflect that. So if our goal is to increase max strength, 3 sets of 12 repetitions is not really going to do that for us, right? Because we're going into the muscular endurance and hypertrophy space, rather than trying to get max recruitment of motor units. And we've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast. We can't harp on it enough. So in general, here's what I love. Some of the things that they have updated. So they have talked about resistance training, power training got included in this guideline. Again, love it. Aerobic training and balance training. So in the aerobic training space, we haven't seen a huge change. But they did include high intensity interval training for individuals with pathology, which I loved. So I have the guideline pulled up. I didn't want to make any mistakes with how I was doing this. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about this. So they have a beautiful table that talks about optimizing body composition for older adults, aka maintaining muscle mass and cardiovascular capacity for as long as possible, increasing bone mass and density, and reducing fracture risk. So these are kind of the 3 things that they talk about. Decrease adipose tissue and visceral fat deposits to optimize cardiovascular health. We have increased muscle mass and function to optimize physical resiliency. And then we have the optimization of bone mass and reducing fracture risk to try and reduce transitions into institutionalized care, because we know that hip fracture, especially secondary to osteopenia or severe osteoporosis, can be a kind of a beginning of this negative spiral that can happen and results in transition into institutionalized care. So when we're thinking about trying to reduce adipose tissue and reduce visceral and central fat atherosclerotic plaque deposits, we're thinking that we're trying to do a combination of aerobic and resistance training. I love this because we're getting out of the cardio is the way type of thought process. So aerobic training 3 to 7 days a week, resistance training got bumped up to 3 days a week. And the intensity is where they are speaking my love language. So when they talked about the need to decrease adipose tissue, they talked about doing aerobic training at 60 to 75% of max capacity, so we're 13 to 14 on the Borg scale, or completing high intensity resistance training that occurs in intervals of 85 to 95% of peak heart rate, 1 to 4 intervals of 4 minutes, 3 times a week. And resistance training got bumped away from the 60% and up to this 70 to 80% of maximum strength with a baseline quantifying of strength. Here's why this is important. We talk about this all the time. If we don't have a baseline level of strength, and we often use AMRAP sets to get a not necessarily a 1 rep max, but we'll get like a 6 rep max or an 8 rep max for our older adults, and then use a 1 rep max estimator table, AKA a 1 rep max calculator that we get off the internet and we don't do the math ourselves. It allows us to be able to apply that progressive overload. With increased muscle mass and function, resistance training remains the same, 3 times a week, 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 10 repetitions, 70-80% of 1 rep max. So if you look at our estimated rep ranges for percentages, when you're in the 70 to 80%, you are working at very close to your 8 to 10 rep max. So this correlates well with a true progressive overload that I think is really important. The third category that they have exercise recommendations for is increasing bone mass and reducing fracture risk. So the modalities that they encourage for older adults, again, this is so above and beyond any other guideline we've had so far, which makes me so excited, is using resistance training, using high impact activities, including jumping, using a weighted vest, as tolerated by the joints, and balance training. So they talk about not doing it for individuals with vertebral fracture and significant osteoporosis because we still don't have enough research. But even with that, this is huge. So they talk about needing, for resistance training, 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 10 repetitions, 6 to 8 big muscle groups, 50 jumps per session for high impact. And for balance, they talk about using balance training as well. 2 to 3 repetitions of 5 to 10 different static and dynamic balance postures. And the intensity for the balance training is to practice the most difficult balance posture not yet mastered. Beautiful. This is finally starting to see what the literature has been supporting for a while now, is that we need to be challenging our older adults, and it is okay for us to be challenging our older adults a little bit more than what our typically fairly conservative guidelines are saying. It then goes on to talk about some of the evidence for a variety of different pathologies and specific clinical considerations for that pathology. So it breaks it down into the role of exercise in primary, secondary, and tertiary disease prevention. Primary with no risk factors, trying to reduce the incidence of disease. Secondary with known risk factors for pathology, what that is going to look like to prevent a full onset of chronic condition. And tertiary is once chronic condition has been defined or has been diagnosed, how to reduce the impact or slow down disease progression. And so it talks about everything from arthritis, dementia, COPD, chronic renal failure, diabetes, stroke, peripheral vascular disease, etc. And so it has not only the goals of exercise, but the different modalities and any clinical considerations that you would have to have, which is a great reference table for our older adults, or for our clinicians who work with older adults to have. All right, big take homes is, and then they also have talking about geriatric syndrome. So again, they're in my wheelhouse, and they're speaking my love language, and they are including for frailty and sarcopenia, resistance training, power training, balance, exercise, gait training. There's just so much good stuff in here that I really encourage you all to give it a read. So kind of bringing this full circle, what are we starting to see with these new exercise guidelines? One, they have given the green light to push the intensity and recognize that our older adults are likely not going to be chronic disease free. And that means that the goal of working with our older adults is to compress morbidity, to reduce the impact of the chronic condition on the older adult, to optimize health and resiliency for the long term. Number two, we're starting to see that they're pushing the boundaries. We're talking about not doing 60%, which is a 15 rep max, and then recommending 3 sets of 8 because that doesn't make any sense for progressive overload. They're starting to recommend 80%, which is close to a 10 rep max. So we're getting close to that line where we're going to drive adaptation and musculoskeletal function. So one, we're starting to see an increase and boost in the intensity of resistance training. Power training at 40% of 1 rep max, which is consistent with the general recommendations for power training being at a lower percentage of external load, has been included in these guidelines. They have talked about the need for jump training, encouraging high impact activities, which again goes completely against the norm, where the general recommendation for people over the age of 75 is, have you thought of chair yoga? And I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek right now, but it's really important for us to be thinking about trying to get our older adults working at the highest level that we can, especially when we as skilled healthcare providers are the ones that are there supervising. That is when they should be taking the most quote unquote risk when it comes to high intensity or pushing the boundaries of physical activity. And in their balance recommendations, they do not just focus on static balance or give a general sweeping recommendation that older adults need balance training. They start talking about how we need to assess balance, how dynamic, dual tasking, and reactive training has to be an important consideration, and that our prescription goes at the level at which balance is not mastered, aka just like progressive overload for resistance training and aerobic training, we need to be pushing the boundary for balance training. This is included in this guideline. And then finally, they've included high intensity interval training as one of the recommendations to perform, working at 85 to 95% of peak heart rate. Get those older adults flexing their heart muscles and getting those heart muscles nice and strong. And staying at 85% for 4 minutes is no joke. So excellent considerations. And then they break it down from pathologies for things to be considering based on different chronic diseases where there might be some yellow flags that we're going to be monitoring, not opposing to exercise, but thinking about as we make our treatment plans. Yes, it is so great. It is hit in every area where the research has really grown, and this is a big conglomerate of individuals and researchers who are working in sarcopenia and frailty, where most people consider that to be a more vulnerable population where they are having more of a tendency to underdose. So really excited to see these exercise recommendations come out through ICFSR, and really looking forward to deep diving into these. So I'm going to be posting on social media, on ICE, and on my personal page around some of the highlights. I'm also going to give everyone the DOI. I'm going to post it underneath. But I am just so excited that these guidelines are starting to come out, because it is unfortunately, or well, fortunately for me, confirmation bias of what we've been preaching in MOA for so long. But it's finally starting to come into these big consensus guidelines that are often used to drive practice forward. So if you have any other questions, please let me know. Sorry if you got hit with really high energy, but I got so excited when I saw these guidelines, and I was screaming yes as I was reading through them. And so I hope you enjoy them, and you can print them out. Some of these tables are really great references. Sorry, I've kind of talked a long time. They're really great references for you to print out and have at your clinic to consider, because they just give you a really nice, concise thought process on how to be using some of these modalities with our older adults. All right, have a wonderful Wednesday, everyone. I will post that DOI below, and I can't wait to dive into this guideline more. Have a great Wednesday, everyone.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.